Hey guys, today we're going to take a look at the brand new Pro 4 series of pickleball paddles from Joola. Now, unfortunately, I only just received these paddles a little under 2 weeks ago, so I haven't had too much time with them. And because of that, this video is going to be more of a first look / first impression style video, but I will be doing some comparisons with how I think they are now and how they stack up against other recent big paddle releases on the market. Alright, but first, let's talk more about the Pro 4 and the construction and technology behind it. So this is a thermoform paddle, so the whole thing is wrapped in a carbon fiber seam, and it's heated in a hot mold for an extended period of time. Like all other thermoform paddles, it does have that edge foam that goes all the way around the edges of the paddle, and like the Gen 3S, it also has that hyperfoam edge wall. So while there is foam that goes around the perimeter, there's a second foam layer, which is the hyperfoam edge wall, that goes from the top half of the paddle, so around here over to here. And what the Pro 4 finally introduces is what's called TFP. So at the bottom corners over here and here, they introduce a heavier and more dense foam to add a bit more stability and some other changes in the gameplay. I know it's a bit hard to see with me pointing the fingers here, so I'm going to put something on the screen right here so you can see the inside of the paddle. They did provide some of these images, and they also did show us, I guess they cut the paddles open for us, so when we were at the event, we were able to see how everything looked with the paddle deconstructed. So based on the presentation that Joola gave us at the Paddle House event and the interviews we were able to conduct with their employees, the point of the TFP, and essentially which is that foam that's down here at the bottom corners, the goal was to improve upon the Gen 3S paddle. So if you're familiar with that, it's a very powerful paddle, but it's very hollow and stiff feeling. And with the Pro 4, what they wanted to do was improve the overall feel of the paddle. So instead of that hollow and stiff feel, they wanted to give you a little bit more flex, so that's why there was more weight added down here, and to just give you a little bit more dwell time so the paddle was easier to control. So with that said, how did the Pro 4s actually play? Well, when I went to the event in Vegas, I basically spent most of the time only hitting the Pro 4s, and I thought they felt very, very similar to the Gen 3S. I didn't have one on me to compare between the two, but I did when I finally got home and was able to hit them side by side. And hitting them side by side is when I would notice a small difference. I wouldn't say it's like a drastic one, but the Pro 4 does feel less stiff and less hollow feeling compared to the Gen 3S. So I think it is slightly more plush, but it's really not a big change. I would say the power and like pop between the two is pretty comparable. If anything, based on feel, I would say the Pro 4 is slightly softer, which might be because it is a bit softer feeling off the face to begin with. But yeah, I think if you like the Gen 3S, I still think you'll like the Pro 4, but it really isn't too big of a change. Maybe you get a little bit more control with it. But overall playability, not a huge difference to the Gen 3S. Now, playability wasn't the only thing that Joola wanted to change in the Pro 4. One big thing that they did want to solve was the durability of the paddle. The Gen 3S was known to break quite often, and with the Pro 4, based on their presentation and based on what the interview said, they did do a lot more testing, and we did get to try out some of these models that what they call their 1000 hit models. So they basically had like brand new ones for us to try out, and they also had ones that were marked. And these paddles were placed in some contraption, and the balls were hitting them 1000 times, and then we got to try them out. I would say those hit harder, and they were definitely hotter paddles, more difficult to control. Supposedly those would still pass like the PB core testing and everything, but like I said, I've only had these paddles for a little under 2 weeks, so I haven't had like too much time with them, and I personally haven't been able to test durability. So at this point, it's just what Joola is saying about the durability, but because this is just first look video, I'm not really going to comment on whether it is going to be more durable and whether it actually is, but it's just take it for what it is from what Joola has said to us. All right, so as for the Pro 4 models themselves, the main ones we got to try out were the Perseus, because this is the one that's coming out first, and then also like the Agassi / like the graph shape. So this is the mold. This is the one on the right here. This is the one that they collaborated with Andre Agassi on, and it's like the mold he chose based on a lot of the other prototypes he got to try out. Um, I know a lot of people don't like this and they say it's kind of ugly. Technically, I will say this is the graph model, so the handle circumference is slightly shorter or slightly thinner compared to the Agassi, but it's the same shape overall and same dimensions. But the Agassi, this one, it's more like top heavy, I would say. Like if we're talking like strictly numbers, the swing weights and twist weights I found were pretty similar between the two. Like there was maybe like a 1 point difference in the swing weight. I believe I want to say off the top of my head, this was like 117. The Perseus 117, and the like my graph was 118, and then for twist weight, I think the graph was 625, and then I think the Perseus was 615. Overall, they're just too close in terms of the metrics, but if you hit them side by side, I think you do tell that difference. The balance overall on the graph is more top heavy, and I think with this like Agassi shape, it tries to be more like, I guess, what a tennis player likes. So more of the available hitting surface is concentrated towards the top of the paddle, and it dies off more towards the bottom. So I think this shape is, it reminds me more of like that Willinator from 6.0. So it's just a more top heavy elongated paddle, more surface area up here. Well, this is just like that traditional elongated paddle that a lot of people are used to. But yeah, these are like this is the two ships that are be coming out first. I know they're still going to have the Scorpius and the Magnus, but those will be releasing at a later date. All right, moving on. Wanted to talk a bit more on how the Pro 4 paddles compare against some of the other big paddle releases on the market. And starting off, let's talk about the 11.624 power. So this has been a really popular recent release into the like power paddle category. Compared to the Pro 4s, this is less like stiff feeling. I think it's a bit more dense, so you don't have that like hollow and poppy feel. You get a little bit more dwell time on the powers, and because of that, I would say that like the overall firepower is noticeably less compared to the Pro 4s on the 11.624 powers, but the powers I think are easier to control. So like the Pro 4s, I put that at like the top of the legal limit in my opinion for a like a paddle in the market, and the powers are closer to like the bottom of like the power category. So I think this is like an easier like entry level power paddle to consider compared to the Pro 4s. Next up, let's talk about another big release this year, and that's the Carbon TruFoams. So this is actually a completely different paddle than the Joola Pro 4s. So this has a full foam core, unlike the polypropylene core inside the Joola's paddles, and it gives you a lot more dwell time. It's a lot more of a plush feel. You can shape the ball a bit better on the TruFoams compared to the Pro 4s, but at the same time, there is significantly less power. So while I would say the Pro 4s are at like the close to the top of the legal limit for power and pop right now, the TruFoams are more in that all court to all court leaning power category. So it's noticeably less powerful, but yeah, it's basically, they're two completely different paddles. If you wanted an all court style paddle, this is one to consider, and obviously if you wanted a power paddle, then that's when you would consider the Joola Pro 4s instead. All right, moving on. So another big paddle release that's actually coming out tomorrow is going to be the Franklin C45. So what's interesting is that this actually isn't a power paddle either. So this does have Gen 3 style tech, and from my understanding, it's what they're calling double thermoformed. So the sheet of polypropylene is thermoformed, and then the paddle mold is cut out of that sheet, and then it's thermoformed again. And then there's also like foam inside the paddle as well. So when you hit this, it does have that like Gen 3 sort of feel. It's got that little hollow, like foamy feel. You can tell it's not a Gen 2, but because like out of the box, it just comes so light. So for reference, the swing weight on mine was 105, and the twist weight I believe was like in the 5.8 range. And that just made the paddle very maneuverable, but also just very small sweet spot and very little power. So if we're talking about this paddle stock, it was not a power paddle. It was, I would say, even like all court leaning control. Like that's just how light it was. And eventually I bumped up the swing weight up to like 118 by adding 0.7 ounces of lead tape on this. And that's where I'm finally starting to get more power on the paddle. But now that I've had it for a few weeks, I know people had mentioned that when they saw the C45 in a tournament, I believe it was like a few weeks or maybe a month ago, the paddle sounded really loud, and I didn't have that until I hit it recently. I was just hitting it earlier, but that's when I noticed that the sound has finally started to change on it. So I do think that this is starting to have some sort of break-in period. I haven't noticed the power getting exponentially hotter, but for now, the sound has gotten louder. And I still think that a lot of the power that's been added onto the paddle has been coming from just me adding overall weight. But, I do think this is a paddle that is trying to break in. And I have a feeling it's going to start getting more power too. But if I had to compare this to the Pro 4, I do think the feel actually gets a bit similar. Like to the stage it is now with how loud it is and how it feels kind of broken in. It does sound loud. It does, feel a bit like my Gen 3S and my Pro 4. The difference is that it just comes stock like so much lighter, and it comes in a hybrid shape. So this is a shape that Joola is not going to have. So I think if you like the feel of like the Joola Gen 3S paddles or like even like Gen 3 foam paddles, but you wanted it in a hybrid shape or you wanted it lighter, that's where I would consider the C45. It's just really customizable. But if you're someone that doesn't like to customize your paddles or just wants it on the heavier end, then I don't think you'll like this. But I think there is a market for people that do just want that Gen 3 style paddle, but want to be able to customize it themselves. Next up, let's talk about the new release from Engage, and that's going to be their Pursuit Pro 1 paddles in different shapes. So the Pursuit Pro line is actually not thermoformed like the Joola paddles are. So they are cold pressed, but while they aren't thermoformed, they do use a slightly different core and some slightly different construction as well. So they're not control paddles, and they're noticeably more power than the average Gen 1 or Gen 1.5 paddle. But they still retain like a softer feel off the face. So these are more plush feeling compared to the Pro 4s. You're gonna get more dwell time on here. But they're also just noticeably less powerful, just like how the TruFoams are. These are more of an all-court style paddle. Now this hybrid shape that Engage has come out with, it's a lot lighter. It's more maneuverable compared to like the Perseus and the Agassi shape. The swing weight is like 109 on mine, but the twist weight is also really low. So I would say the hybrid shapes from Engage, they need a lot of perimeter weighting to bump them up, but at their core, they're just all court style paddles. And, like the TruFoam's completely different paddle from the Pro 4s. So if you're looking for a power paddle, this is not one to consider. All right, so the last paddle we're going to talk about is the Proton Flamingo. So for those of you unfamiliar with the Flamingo, it's basically supposed to be a 15 millimeter version of the Gen 3S in terms of construction. So it is a 15 millimeter thermoform paddle, and it does have that hyperfoam edge wall, but that second foam layer only goes around the top half of the paddle, just like the Gen 3S. But in terms of how it plays, I don't think it's anything like the Gen 3S. I think it's a lot more springy off the face. It's lighter. It's not as powerful. But I also only had like a very brief time with it, and that Flamingo had only had like 1 week of use, so my opinion could have changed. So I'm just really comparing my first impression of the Flamingo against the Gen 3S. But in terms of first impressions of the Pro 4 versus the Flamingo, I would say the Pro 4 is more power, more pop. Because it has that TFP, it does have a little bit more of a denser, plusher feel, more dwell time on here compared to the Flamingo, which is just, it's a quicker paddle, but it's also just lighter and more springy off the face. Supposedly more durability in the Joola Pro 4 because of that TFP and the testing that's been done, but that's something that I haven't been able to test myself. But anyways, that's it for the Flamingo. Unfortunately, I just didn't have too much time with it. But yeah, that's just the first impression of Flamingo versus the Pro 4. All right, so that's it for the paddle comparisons. Now, as for the Pro 4 itself, in a nutshell, it's basically the Gen 3S. It's just so similar to it. The TFP does provide some small changes, like there's a little bit less power overall, in my opinion, a little bit more dwell time, a little bit more control, a little bit more of a plush feel, but it's all a really small change. I would still say the Gen 3S and the Pro 4 are at the top of the legal power paddle category. So if that's what you're looking for, the Pro 4 is something to consider. Or if you are a fan of the Gen 3S, the Pro 4 is going to be an easy recommendation for you. I will just say like the TFB doesn't really do much to the paddle, in my opinion. It's a really small change, and it doesn't really revolutionize the Gen 3 tech at all. Like it's just a small side grade to it, in my opinion. What it's really dependent on is how well these durability claims hold. So if this indeed is a more durable Gen 3S, then I think this is a fantastic paddle. Because as of right now, like there's no alternative to Gen 3S. If you like the Gen 3S, there's no other small company or no like paddle with a similar feel. But if this holds true with the durability and it's like a Gen 3S that doesn't break and has better quality control, then I think this is going to be a really good paddle on the market. That said, if you do want to pick one up, I do have a link in my video description. It's not going to give you a discount right now, but it does help support the channel if you do use it when you buy the paddle. As for the other paddles I did mention, I do have discount codes for most of them, so I'll link them in the video description as well below. But anyways, that's it guys. Thanks for watching.